Let's start with exercise number 1 and hook up a button, this button here, to toggle the displaying of the 2 paragraphs. This should be rather straightforward. I'm going to set up my data property here, and I will create a new property, choose any name you want. I'll name it is shown, and I'll initially set it to true. Next, I will add the if to this first paragraph and set it equal to is shown. On the second paragraph, I'll set up the else, and that is only one way of doing it. You could also say the if not is shown, that would be the same. But let's go with the else here. And on the button, well, I will set up a click listener with the add syntax here, and I will simply switch is shown to what it currently not is. So I will reverse it from true to false and vice versa. If I now hit Control Enter and hit this button, you see I can toggle between the 2 paragraphs exactly what I wanted. The exercise also says to solve this with vShow. And if you want to do it with vShow, I will basically copy the 2 paragraphs to show both. I can simply say vShow, but as I mentioned in the exercise video, vElse does not work for is shown, which is why we don't see or me now a second time. Instead here, we will have to fall back to the other solution of simply reversing the condition and saying, okay, only show this if is shown as false. Now you can see toggling works for both, but of course, if we inspect this, you see, if we shrink this down a bit, you see that here we still see the you either see me paragraph, but the display is set to none, whereas directly below the button, where we also would theoretically have such a paragraph, we don't see it because this first paragraph uses the if and therefore is completely removed from the DOM. That is the key difference to take away here, as was also explained in the lectures throughout this module. In exercise number 2, we want to loop through any array of our choice. So I will create a new array and name it array here in the data property, and I will simply store some names here. So I'll store my name because I like it. So you should like your name, I guess. And some other names, which are totally up to you. Then here in this unordered list, we want to output them all. And of course, the best way, the stupidest way, to be honest, would be to simply, well, write max and then a new list item for Anna. We don't want to hard code it, of course. We want to use v4 here to loop through this array. Then the syntax, as you learned it, is element. This name is totally up to you. Choose whatever name you like. In array, with array referring to this array property of our view instance. And we can then output element here. Now, we not only shall print the element, which would work if you hit Control Enter, but also the index. To do this, I enclose the element in parentheses and add a second kind of argument here, which I'll call index. Again, also this name is up to you. Only the order here matters. First one is the element, second one is the index. And I can then output, let's say, separate by a dash, index here as well. And after hitting Control Enter, we see the index next to the name. So this was exercise number 2. In exercise number 3, we want to loop through this object and print all the key value pairs here. We also want to print the index. Well, first let's create the object. I'll name it my object here. It obviously is an object, and I can simply copy and paste this. So let's do it like this, and now split this up over multiple lines to make it a bit easier to read, I guess. So this is the object through which I want to loop. I can also use v4 for this. So let's set it up on this list item. But now I can output the value of each key by saying value in my object. Vue.js automatically detects that this is an object, and I could output value. If I hit Control Enter now, we see this list down there. But we're not only interested in the value, we also want to get the key name and the index. So time to enclose value in parentheses. And then here we would have value still as the first argument, the key name as the second one. Again, all these names are totally up to you, only the order matters. And then the index, I'll name it I here to mix things up, as the third argument. I can then output value, key name, and the index in the end here, like this. If I now hit Control Enter, we see Lord of the Rings, which is the title, has an index of 0, the name, which is the author, the index of 1, and so on. This is how we can loop through an object. Again, Vue.js is automatically detecting whether it's an array or object, which influences which values or which data we can extract from it. Only element and index in the case of an array, and value, key name, and index in the case of an object. And then how we can use this information to output it like we do here. Time for the last exercise, printing this object here, and then also printing this data array in this object. That will be a bit more complex since we got this nested array, but not every field in this object is a nested array, so we can't blindly loop through all the properties of this object. But let's create the object first. I'll name it test data, like that, and also split that up over multiple lines. And now we want to create a loop. Well, first I can create my list item here with v4, and I can output the values of this object, so value in test data, and that would then be like that. If I hit Control Enter, we see test object and this array being printed as a string here. That's nice, but I want to loop through that array. So I will actually split this up over multiple lines, because here I want to conditionally output the values if there's a need for it. I'll add some divs here, and on these divs I want to loop through the elements in value. Value now, of course, refers to the individual value of each key value pair in my object. So this is this reference. And this can be an array, like in the case of data, but it could also not be one in the case of name. Turns out name is a string which actually can be treated as an array, as it is a chain of characters. But to make it really clear that this will not always work, I'll also add an ID, which is a number, which clearly is not an array, no matter how you look at it. But I also don't want to treat name as an array. How do we do that? We kind of need to conditionally output this div. Here I will do it with template tags, and I will say that inside these template tags I want to output this loop, and I can check this with the array object and the isArrayHelper method, where I pass value as an argument. This checks if value is an array, and only if it is, I will reach this for loop. I'll add another template below where I add velse. This has to be the same element type as a side note, so if you use template up here, this also has to be a template. And here I want to output the value like that. With that, if I then also print my element here in this div and now hit Control Enter, we see that this now works. We check if it is an array, and only if it is an array do we print the values in this inner for loop. Otherwise, we simply output it here with the velse block with this value string interpolation here. So this is how we mix vif and v4 to conditionally show or attach this v4 loop, or these elements created with the v4 loop, so that this v4 loop also only gets executed if it can be executed, if we actually do have an array, like we do here for this value when it is this data property here of our object. That concludes the conditionals and list module. I hope you feel confident using vif and v4. In the end, it's really straightforward syntax. You also see a more complicated use case here with nested loops and conditional checking. The easier setups, as seen above here, are probably the more common ones, but it's good to know them all and feel confident using them, which I sure hope you do right now. Let's continue with the next videos.